let's get the big announcement out right off the bat. Back in February, I began work on a brand new book series. Unlike Paws of Stars, this is a wholly original story with original characters in a new world and with a new plot and magic system. Now that I've gone through all this, I wanted to share with you how my process for setting up this book series worked, to give some direction to anyone who might be trying to write their own works now. Also, I just need to babble on about this story a little bit after keeping it so close to the chest for so long. I'd like to start by saying that there is no one correct way to start your writing. Virtually every amateur and professional writer you go to is going to have a different type and level of preparation they do before getting started, and different routines to help inspire them during the conception, production, and editing phases. This is just what has worked for me. Inspiration, or finding the big idea I'm aiming for, is my hardest part of the creative process. It's difficult for me to come up with ideas I like on the fly, so I prefer to do a lot of preparation ahead of time so that when it comes time to write, all I have to figure out is how to connect the ideas together, which is the most fun and easy part of the process for me. As a result, I have a 9-step process I went through for both Paws of Stars and this new story before I ever wrote a word of the narrative. Step 1 is the initial conception, or brainstorming. This just consists of brain dumping any ideas you have about the story you want to create. The 3 basic elements of a story are character, plot, and theme, so whatever the spark is tends to be one of those. A message you want to send, an action scene or story you want to see play out, or a character journey that you want to write. At this stage, unless you already have a specific idea in mind that you want to write about, it's better to plaster down as many things that grip you as you can think of, either to choose between them as a starting point, or to combine multiple into different sections of your story. Coming from a roleplay background with my friends, as well as a philosophy one, I tend to get latched onto a character journey. For this new story, the spark was the journey of one cat who would become the main character. I, of course, ended up caring about all the main characters' arcs very quickly, but it was one particular arc that gripped me. I also knew from the start I wanted it to have animal characters because, well, that's my preference, and I was originally going to make them squirrels, my personal favorite animal. But the journey I wanted for the main character actually worked really well with the allegory of being a former house pet, so cats are what I went with primarily. Step 2 is, for me, cast building. Once the basic concept of a main character is in place, you can fill out the rest of the cast with characters who either validate or challenge them on different points in their arc. For example, off the top of my head, if you had a character like Hollyleaf, who is fully committed herself to upholding clan values, never questioning the code, and becoming someone important, then giving her a mentor like Thornclaw, who validates her clan-centric tendencies but challenges her when it comes to focusing her energy on herself, could make for an interesting dynamic. This is also a good time to decide the rough size of your support cast, characters who will be central to your story in reference to the main character or characters, as opposed to the minor characters who will play roles in only a small piece of the story, and background characters, characters there to flesh out the world without receiving much or any narrative focus. In my new story, this is where I created 4 other cats, 3 kittens, and a dog to help in the main character's journey. For me personally, it often helps in this step to make character playlists that specifically go beat by beat through each character's arc, rather than just having the proper vibe. This way I can listen to those playlists and get into the mind of each character. It also helps me start thinking about the trajectory of the series. Step 3 is world building. Based on the list of character arcs I had for my cast, it was time to design a world that would cause them to go through those arcs. Where should the characters live? What obstacles would pull on their personalities or relationships? Or, if you started from the plot side, what setting would help that plot to take place? This was a relatively lengthy step for me because it involved creating a world, numerous different groups to live in that world, placement, values, and skills for each group, as well as the dynamics between them, a calendar to give characters ways to mark the time and look forward to events, and a complete magic system which I then applied to every character in the world so far. The specifics of what you think you need for your world will vary, and, as ever, I recommend making a checklist of ideas you have so you can spend most of your dedicated work time fleshing out the details. But it can be an arduous process regardless. Step 4 is where we get to character development. With the base character profiles of your main cast done, you can flesh them out so they fit into the world and with each other. This is where you get to really decide who they are and make each of them a compelling character to you on their own. For me, I enjoy using this time to complete full character sheets that detail things like appearance, the way the character carries themselves, hobbies, personality traits, relationships, values and where they came from, self-reflection, and how they react to different emotions. Of course, it also includes a section to detail their backstory, which I did with bullet points since I had ended up summarizing their backstories in the other sections by the time I got to this one. This is also when I went back to readjust the characters' playlists, causing them to double in size as I fleshed them out to include their new details, and changed or removed songs that no longer fit with my image of them. During this step, it can also be helpful to begin listing the important characters that come up in your characters' lives, such as family, friends, rivals, or lovers, since they can often be used as support characters, antagonists, or propulsion for your characters' arcs in the story. Time for Step 5, which focuses on plot and theme. This took a fair bit more experimentation for me personally to be happy with it, but different steps of the process will take more or less time for different people. I knew I wanted the overall themes and a journey involving the main character's character arc, and I already had some of the plot beats, in particular what I wanted in the beginning and end, listed in my vague ideas brainstorm from Step 1. In this stage, though, it was time to trim, add, or change as needed. For me, I found it helpful to list out every desired plot point on a character-by-character basis, and then sort them all from what would go in the beginning to what would go in the end, using the character arc playlists as a guide. As I was doing that, I could tell some areas where I needed to come up with something more, or cut out or combine redundant stories. And in some cases, the roles of characters entirely changed so that they would fit in the structure. The broad theme was a good guiding light in this process as well. Themes like this could be agency, balance in relationships, family, or trauma. They're things that your story is overall saying something about. At this stage, I didn't make it much more specific than that, instead using it to remind me what my characters should be encountering, exploring, sharing, and learning with each other over the course of the plot, and what the new main antagonist was opposing, to an extent. I used the theme as a sort of compass to help me pick one option or direction over another when I was deliberating, making sure that most scenes could tie back into it in one way or another. When I had everything I could think of down, I chunked the full set of plot beats into books and determined this would be a 5-book series. Step 6 is a big one, the writing of the initial series Bible. This involves collecting all the information you've amassed so far into one place. I prefer using a single document so I can Control F and search for things later, and because many programs have built-in features that allow you to sort your work within the document. This is a great time to look at what you have and figure out what else you need in order to flesh out the world to your liking. Personally, it's where I located a list of shorter character profiles I needed to make for various support and antagonistic characters, and where I decided to make a complete record of every character that exists in the world. The group they are a part of, a simplified personality for them, any relationships they had, and which part of the magic system they fit into. I created all of that and added it to the series Bible as well. The document in full is currently 150 pages long, so having copies of everything in their own documents as well as in the series Bible can give you more options when you're searching for things later. Also note that I have never come across a program that doesn't begin to struggle to load documents past about 100 pages and decrease in loading speed as the length increases, so having shorter documents as options will also make that part easier. Step 7 is what some people use as their first step, the outlines of the book, or books. Personally, this was the hardest one to start, so to make it easier on myself, I made a bunch of shorter lists of the beats in each main character's arc, as well as the plot beats, and divided those between the books as well. Using those, as well as the big list of plot beats I compiled before, I made documents for each book's outline so I could focus on one at a time. I decided the points of view for each book based on the character and plot arc bullet points, and from there it was time to write the detailed chapter-by-chapter outlines, covering all of the overall beats for each book and including as many of the plot beats as flowed well into the story. While working on these, it's important to remember that you can add or delete as many ideas in the moment as you need to make the story flow and to fit the characterization you are building. I recommend keeping the past and future outline documents open while you're working on them, so if you have an idea, you can change anything you need to. It's a good idea to allocate at least a few days of time to each of your outlines, not just because they can be lengthy, but because it will give you time and quiet moments away from work to get sparks of ideas or work through any problems you're having in getting the story to look right. Personally, I've used about 2 weeks for each, and even with that extra time, you shouldn't be afraid to change things later. Speaking of, Step 8 is editing. Now, in the creation of a story, you're always editing, and it's important to not be married to any one idea you come up with along the way. Make sure to do research into any important topics around your story, talk with people who might experience things similar to your characters, and get opinions from family or friends on how your ideas could be expanded. Sometimes, if I notice a character shares traits with a family member or friend, I will even ask them questions to get an idea of how that character might react to situations or interact with others. It's also always good to take notice of other people in situations, as well as watch and read material that you enjoy, in case any of it sparks an idea that would apply well to your story. Before even getting to this step, I had already changed the number of main characters 3 times, reinvented who each character was between 3 and 5 times, and altered or uprooted the overall plot, theme, and number of books several times as well. It's something you should always be willing to do, so you can make your story better. But at this stage, once the book outlines are finished and before you start writing, it's the first time you can look at your whole story front to back and see if everything fits. Give yourself time to look it over, get a second opinion if you like, and don't be afraid to change anything at this stage, because it's the easiest time for you to do it. Anything from character names to pacing, the number of books to specific or overall plot points, the adding or deletion of characters, changes in motivation or personalities, adding more or less action or verbal conflict, more or less relationships or world building. You can change anything to improve the cohesion of your story. See if you run astray from your themes, if any of the plotlines feel disconnected from the overall train of the story, or if the personality of a character changed from how you wrote them in the beginning compared to the end. Make any edits you like. Remember, unless you're already a contracted professional writer, there isn't a deadline here unless you give yourself one. Take whatever time you need. Step 9 is what I'll call final preparations. It's where you give all the books and the series, if you're planning one, names, at least preliminary ones, and get your writing setup of choice, well, set up. If you're me, that means making some sorted folders with 1 folder per book and 1 document per chapter so you're ready to write. If you'd like to hold yourself to a deadline, like I did for Paws of Stars, this is a good time to make the overall schedule of your writing. Be realistic with yourself and keep in mind your other priorities. Also, don't forget to leave some time at the end of each book for editing. It's a really important process at each stage of the journey, and it comes down to more than typos or misgendering your characters. But that will have to wait for a while, because for me, at the time I'm writing this, I'm on step 7. I finished the outlines for 2 of the 5 books, but I of course have a ways to go from here before I start the chapter writing, and before I actually name the series. That's why I've been calling it the writing project, the new project, or, to some of my friends and family, the cat and dog story, after the 2 most prominent characters. It has already been a genuinely enjoyable experience, and with each thing I've added or edited, I've become more excited about the project. I started working on this series primarily because I wanted to practice my world building, in the way that Paws of Stars let me practice plot progression. But over the course of the last many months, I actually fell in love with the characters, concepts, and messages worked into this story. And it ended up turning into some things that I've wanted to see in any fictional series for a long time. At the forefront of that excitement is the lives and arcs of the main characters, and that's what I'd most like to share with you for the remainder of the video. I can't talk about all the characters, and I'm limiting myself to information you would be able to learn in the first book, but I have already put an awful lot of thought into the stories of my main cast, and I would finally like to introduce them to you. As I do so, I'll be drawing the reference sheets for each character I discuss, based on the concepts I've been drawing here. You may have seen these already if you happened to check my art fight back in July, but this is how I drew them. First up, of course, is the main character that inspired me to write this story, Lotta, short for Charlotte. A 4-year-old house cat with an average height and a plumper, fluffy build. I would tell you about the magic she holds, but I'd rather save the magic system discussion for its own video because this video is long enough as it is. When she was very little, Lotta was orphaned on the streets and taken in by a kitten foster program before being moved to the shelter, and, finally, into her home. As a consequence, she hasn't gotten to know many cats throughout her life, save for the ones she met during her couple of months in the shelter, and her only understanding of relationships for a long time came from the people. They cared for her in a parental way, and she loved them for that. She found great peace in her home, with routines of sunbathing, watching animals pass by, and play fighting with a hanging mouse toy, along with, of course, cuddling with her people, a lovely couple who just moved in together before getting her. A couple of years into her stay, a new being was introduced into her life. The people adopted a dog. A very large, very energetic dog. It took Lotta quite a long time to get used to the new addition, and vice versa, she's sure. But eventually, the dogs seemed to calm down around her, and they got most of their energy out with the woman anyway, when they went out together. Once she grew more used to the dog, it turned out that Manny, was a very loyal and predictable companion, and Lotta did enjoy having such a big, fluffy pillow to cuddle up with when the people were busy. They ended up becoming quite the team, recognizing the telltale signs of the morning through the light and chirping birds, and joining their voices and talents together to make sure the people woke up on time. It was her responsibility, after all. They cared for her and kept her safe. In return, she would bat them on the heads or meow in their faces to make sure they weren't late for breakfast. The woman would feed them in the morning, Lotta would be able to nap by the man while he tapped away at the captivating electronic box, and then the man would fill the kitchen with delicious scents as he created food for their dinner, often sneaking Lotta and Manny their own little bites if they asked for long enough. Her family was perfect, but it couldn't last forever. And just to let you know, this is where the light spoilers for the first book are coming into play. One day, the people left, as they often did, at least once every 7 days, and they didn't come back. Manny and Lotta were left completely alone, and soon enough Lotta was thrust back into the same shelter that she left behind when she was a kitten, even separated from Manny, who was put in the dogs area of the shelter rather than with her. Her entire world was in that house. The people who cared for her, the routines and experience she had gained, the warm comfort Manny provided, all of it was gone. But whatever it takes, if she gets any sort of chance, she will get them back. Speaking of Manny, let's talk about her. Yes, her. Manny is short for Manitoba, much like Lotta is short for Charlotte, and both were picked because they were very important places to the people Manny and Lotta lived with. So neither of them were named that before they were adopted. With that out of the way, Manny is a 2-year-old dog, mostly Great Pyrenees, but not a pure breed. Also, as a note, I am drawing her here on the same reference sheet setup as the rest of the cat cast, so her proportions and size are off from what they would be on their own. She's a large adult dog in reality. Now, Manny is a dog, as you might have guessed by now. As a result, she and Lotta, and the rest of the cat cast, can't talk directly to each other and be understood. Because of that, there's a lot about her that you, as a reader seeing through Lotta's eyes, might never learn for certain. Without some work. Because of that, I'm more willing to let you in on some information about her here. Manny was born several hours away from her current town. She, her mom, and her siblings were rescued when they were puppies and spent time growing up and receiving early socialization training in a rescue program, which Manny genuinely enjoyed. She got used to both cats and kids very early, but also got to know her siblings and the other dogs in the rescue. Unlike Lotta, she had a wide social circle very early, but she was still more than happy to eventually meet and be adopted by the people. It was good enough that the man was a spectacular chef and secretly handed Manny treats when she was a good enough dog, but even better, the woman seemed to run outside for most of every day, and often took Manny along with her. They would go on hikes up hills, in runs around parks, play fetch in the yard, and, of course, go swimming in the lakes or even the ocean on special occasions. She got to meet plenty of other dogs in the city on these adventures, some who came by regularly, and some who seemed to find their trips around her town as special as she found trips to the ocean. It was always deeply invigorating to swap experiences with these other dogs, and to feel the wind and water in her fur wherever they went. But nothing could ever beat the joy Manny felt when she got home to hop into the bed with both people and her big little sister, the cat. When she first arrived, she did try to treat Lotta the way she treated the young cats back at the rescue program, but Lotta was much less playful and calmer than the cats Manny knew before, so it took some time to adjust to her different temperament. As she built up a routine, though, waking up first thing to patrol the house, returning to wake Lotta, and joining with her to wake up the people for the day, Lotta came to trust her more, and soon they were snuggling together each evening and working together to let people know important things like, "It's time to eat," "It's time to play," and "No, not a bath!" Of course, just like Lotta, she loses them one day, being sent into what is, for her, a completely unfamiliar shelter, separated from everyone she knows. She's terrified and has no idea why she ended up here in the first place, but her top priority, if even that is possible, is finding Lotta again. She needs to protect her. On the other side of the shelter, we have Spring. She is a tall 4-year-old cat who is best classified as a house cat, but, well, I'll explain that shortly. She was born to a house cat named Carmen, and though Carmen knew their father and seemed to speak with him regularly, her kittens never met him, only learning his name and that he lived in the city. Although Spring did have some wish to meet him one day, it never bothered her while she had her mother as well as her 3 siblings, Summer, Autumn, and Winter, of course, at her side. However, when she and her siblings got old enough, Carmen's people sent them off to the shelter to find their own homes. Carmen promised she would love them, but they would find much more happiness when they could get people of their own, with houses to become accustomed to and their whole lives ahead of them. Even though it meant leaving her mom, and probably some of her siblings, Spring was excited at the prospect of finding her own place to belong and make her own life. Whoever they were, the people who chose her would care for her specifically, and she would get a chance to feel the special connection Carmen did with her people. Her world, whichever one it was just waiting for her. So she waited. At the shelter, Summer and Winter were adopted together after the first week, and Spring actually befriended another young cat who was at the shelter at the same time. They swapped ideas for how to get adopted before the people came in to look at them, always played together during the free play hours while the people cleaned their cages, and told each other stories about where they came from and where they hoped to end up when they were adopted. Spring included Autumn as often as she could, but she couldn't help feeling like she was growing closer with this new cat than she had ever been to anyone before. She even began to wish that they would be adopted together, much like Summer and Winter were. A month into their stay, Autumn was adopted as well, but Spring and her friend were still there, and Spring became extremely excited about the prospect of leaving with her. However, that didn't end up happening. 2 months in, her friend was adopted, and it was without her. Trying her best to avoid being upset, Spring continued to try making herself appealing each day as the people passed by to look through everyone. Her mother's words rang in her ears, that her own world was waiting for her. So she kept waiting. And waiting. And waiting. As the years went by, the people passing by looked at her less and less, focusing more on the younger kittens that kept being brought in. Over time, she grew less and less optimistic about the possibility of being adopted at all, especially seeing how long many of the older cats were left in the shelter, while some of the kittens were adopted within a day of arrival. Spring began to take care of the new kittens to arrive, helping them get used to the routine of the shelter, get past their homesickness for wherever they came from before, and prepare to be adopted, with many of the same techniques Spring created with her friend so long ago. Cats kept trying to tell her that it was possible she could still be adopted, but she had just about lost hope, and she didn't want to get her hopes up again just for them to be crushed every day. However, when a brand new older cat arrived in the shelter and told her stories about where they came from, she began formulating an idea. One only strengthened when, after almost 4 years apart, her old friend arrived back at the shelter with a goal of her own in mind. If she wasn't going to be adopted, there was another route. She could put her life into her own paws. She could find her own world. But not by waiting. And who was the cat who inspired her to do this? Well, let's talk about Elm. They're an 8-year-old agender cat, which for the purposes of this story I have chosen to call a Quinn, in association with Molly's and Tom's. Unlike the other characters I have described so far, Elm was born as a wild dweller, and has never wanted to be a house cat. They lived in peace with their family for all their life, spending time with their parents, brother, and sister as they learned about climbing, hunting, and even constructing little hammocks to rest in. Often, cats would pass through the area they lived in, either coming from other wild areas or from cities, and Elm got used to giving advice and guidance to these cats to help them find their way. Hearing so many of their stories and, well, with the special talent they uniquely had, Elm became very insightful and skilled at reflection, both over others' emotions and their own. As a result, they were able to discover fairly early how they felt about the gender that others assumed them to be, and came out to their parents and siblings soon after. An easygoing and loving family, they took the news in stride, and before long, it was strange for them to think about Elm as anything other than agender. As much as Elm absolutely adored their family and home, though, there was an element of life they still always wanted to experience. The joy of finding love, and starting a new family together with them. A couple of years before the story begins, it happened. Elm met a traveler, like any other, who was on a wander and trying to find a place to settle down. While they were in the area, Elm showed them around, taught them what they knew of the skills that would be useful here, and learned from them how to make puzzles and hunts from the surrounding brush to entertain each other, and Elm's little sister in particular. Over time, Elm grew closer and closer to them, especially as they too, inspired by discussions with Elm over the months they had spent together, said she would rather be known as a Molly. A year later, they decided to get married, and in a picturesque expression of fairy tale love, they lived happily ever after with Elm's family in the woods. Well, for a few months. However, outside of their bubble of happiness, forces were growing that they couldn't have prepared for. Elm was confronted with death, betrayal, and exile from their loving home. They went with their wife to live in the city for safety, but they became separated along the way. Elm was entirely alone. Save for a pair of city cats they became at least acquainted with. And then, as one last insult from the world, people captured them and they were taken to the shelter, where they met and told pieces of their story to an eager Spring. They have no intention of staying here, though. They need to get their wife back. They need to get their home back. If that means working with house cats of all things, so be it. The final pair I'd like to cover for today are the cats Elm became acquainted with during their time in the city. They're a pair of siblings, and first up is the brother, Foxtail. This is also where I will have the hardest time actually describing his character, because who he is and what his and his sister's backstories are like are things that both siblings keep a tight lid on for a while due to extreme and sometimes debilitating levels of emotion. However, what I can tell you about them is what the point of view characters can determine about them. Foxtail and his sister are characters that our crew will meet after they have left the shelter, and Elm is trying to guide them around the city. Though they live in the city now, like Elm, they were once wild dwellers, a past they don't talk much about. As the only other cats that Elm has an existing connection to around here, they thought it would be easier to get brand new city cats up to speed with Foxtail and his sister's help. While Elm does more or less trust them, they have a hard time bonding with everyone else, for several reasons. Foxtail, for one, is immediately off-putting due to his fiery temper and disdain towards the naive, unskilled, optimistic house cats he was presented with. He seemed very protective of his sister, and, at least, got along with Elm, not to mention he was pretty knowledgeable about hunting, scavenging, and navigating the city. Foxtail seemed curious about Manny in particular, once he confirmed that they were a friend of theirs and not a random dangerous dog following them in secret. As he showed them around the city, introduced them to other cats in the area, and began to teach them some basic skills, it became clear that there was value in knowing him. Yet, for Lotta, and especially for Spring, Foxtail's unfamiliar expletives and constant complaints about how foolish or useless they were as a result of their house cat heritage was doing him no favors in making any friends. At one point, Spring will confront him about this attitude, and ask what makes wild dwellers so much better, which is where we will learn that Foxtail holds as much disdain for the cats in the wild as he does for the cats who lived with people, if not more. He doesn't trust the cats he's around now, and perhaps doesn't really trust anyone but his sister, so he doesn't elaborate at any point in this book on what it is about wild dwellers that causes him to hate them so much, or why Elm was exempt from that standard. However, enough hints are given that I would hope the reader is able to understand, by the end, he isn't just bitter for its own sake. He's diligent, patrolling whatever area he is in and thoroughly checking for other cats or dangers before he can feel comfortable in a shelter, and is a very precise and skillful hunter. Important as well is how, despite being the one to introduce the group to most of the cats in the city, there will be one instance where Foxtail and his sister actively hide from some oncoming cats. I'll be able to tell you more about Foxtail eventually, but for now, all I can share is what he presents to the others, and that is not an immediately appealing character. My final character to introduce, Foxtail's sister, will be a bit of an easier task to explain. She is no less closed off than her brother, and it will certainly be a task in later material to show us what lies in her heart rather than on the outside. But whatever experiences she and her brother went through, she came out of it with less overt anger and more hesitance, allowing her to show off slightly more colors in her first appearance. Privet, named for the plant and not hello in Russian, is an elegant, long-furred Molly who, in many ways, looks like the perfect encapsulation of a pretty kitty. She has flowing fur that somehow hasn't constantly tangled, a large and fluffy tail and mane, and marbled hazel eyes just like her brother. Unlike him, though, everything about her is perfectly symmetrical and minimal, beautiful in its simplicity. Except for her left front leg. The only thing that might register as an imperfection in her appearance is her much shorter, thinner leg that has a marking at the end as if to draw attention to it. This leg is entirely limp due to a condition Privet has had since birth. She cannot move or use it, and it didn't grow with the rest of her body, resulting in its different appearance. She is a perfectly capable cat, and is in fact extremely intelligent, especially in regards to the magic system of the world. But when we meet her, she seems either very shy or very insecure. She often hides behind her brother, either literally or figuratively, by allowing him to speak for her in conversations. When she does talk on her own, though, and in particular when the topic of their magic comes up, sparks of confidence and almost bossiness seem to come through. Like Foxtail, she avoids speaking much about her life as a wild dweller before they came to the city, but based on some conversations she has with other cats, Spring especially, it can be inferred that she's trying to leave something behind, to remake herself after whatever might have happened. A lot can also be shown from her relationship with her brother. While they do often fall into a dynamic of Foxtail protecting and speaking for Privet, there are also times when Privet does better than expected at anything from hunting to teaching, and Foxtail seems to become almost annoyed with her? Although it's not a feeling he voices, unlike most of the emotions he feels. Privet is clear about how dangerous the world is, and that this isn't a mess house cats should get into if they don't have to. But our protagonists have their own reasons for wanting to stay, so it might just be a matter of time until they're confronted with the very world Privet seems to be running from. All I'll say now is, she genuinely believed she had a good life before, working with the cats who loved her most for a cause they could all support. But she was a fool, wasn't she? That's probably what Foxtail thinks. Now all that she can hope is that she can outrun it before it catches up to her. But considering that I am the author, I know that won't work forever. Those are far from all of the characters in the story, and you might have even seen some of the concepts I did of the others in the first part of the drawing. But this is roughly what the first book's main cast would be, so I'll leave the story there for now. Obviously, there's a lot about these characters' journeys during and sometimes even before the story that I couldn't let you in on to avoid spoiling later material. But let me assure you that I've already put so much thought into all of these little buds, and by the time you are watching this, I might be starting the chapter writing process. If you have any questions about anything I discussed today, or if there are any topics in this new story that you'd like me to cover down the line, please let me know. I am extremely excited about this project, and I'm so glad I got the chance to talk about it today, at long last. For the next video, we'll resume your usual Warriors programming though, don't worry. Thank you for watching, and always remember that organization will set you free. And if you have a project you want to make, go out and do it!